work here. And we continue our examination of the work or works of Ioan Petru Culianu. This is going to be a rather technical panel with people who have a serious background in the history of religions and philosophy, history of ideas, who come from several countries, from 3 countries, but you'll see that this is more complicated than that. First of all, we will have a paper by Eduard Iricinschi, then another by Igor Tavilla, who is with us via Zoom from Italy, Eduard Iricinschi via Zoom from Germany, and Horia Corneliu Cicortaș, who joins us also on Zoom, hopefully soon, also from Italy. By way of introduction, very short introduction, I have to tell you that I am familiar with the research of Eduard Iricinschi in the field of Culianu studies since he started. I had, for some, once again, accident of fate, the privilege of being the supervisor of his MA paper at the University of Bucharest many years ago, when I happened to be for several semesters in Bucharest, and he was there completing his studies. He went on, of course, studying, and then he got his PhD from Princeton, and then he continued in very technical subfields in the history of religions, Manichaean studies, Nag Hammadi literature, heresiology, things of this sort, very technical, that require a very, very serious technical training in the languages, cultures, bibliographies, scholarships of all these fields. They are disparate if you look at them from a certain distance, but they are interconnected. And I think while working on these, on his PhD and then on his postdoctoral projects on various fields, Eduard Iricinschi preserved his interest in the work of Culianu, acquired a number of technical, highly specialized forms of expertise which he could apply later on to the study of Culianu's work. And so I said this several times, and I hope this will happen soon. I hope this is going to be the author of the first monograph on Culianu that will cover the entire work of Culianu. And this is a sample of it, I hope. And that is how to become a magister of the art. Magic and the art of memory in Culianu's fiction. So, in case you hear me or no, I'm here, you know I'm here. Eduard, the floor is yours.
Okay. I would like to thank the organizers first. I'd like first to thank the organizers of this colloquium for their invitation. On a personal level, I would like to express my immense gratitude to Sorin Antohi and Teresa Culianu Petrescu for their decades-long support, kindness, and patience with my work. As a way of summary, I will divide my paper in 5 parts. In the first part, I will talk about Culianu's fiction and his academic work, how they come together, how they echo each other. In a second part, I will discuss Culianu's fiction and its riddles, its ludibria. We encountered this term as ludibrium yesterday. In the third part of my talk, I will discuss about the art of memory and how it is reflected in the novel Hesperus. In the fourth part, I'll discuss about magic, according to Culianu, his collection of short stories, Le Pergamen Diaphane, and the ancient figure of Zostrianos. And finally, in the fifth part, I will have some conclusions. So let's go to work. First part, about Culianu's fictions and academic work. There is a fine system of correspondences yet to be fully unraveled between Ioan Petru Culianu's fiction and his academic work. Themes and topics, obsessions and interests, question asks and raised again in different guises, all migrate from one branch of Culianu's intellectual work to another. Ioan Petru Culianu's two different kinds of intellectual production developed together, feeding off each other and enhancing each other as they progressed along. A closer examination of the academic texts and fiction Culianu wrote in the 1980s shows a parallel progress of various topics along the three main channels of his academic growth: magic in the Renaissance, gnosis and dualism, and ecstatic experiences. For instance, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, published in 1984 in French, perhaps the most innovative and daring book Culianu wrote, echoes out in most of the literature he wrote during the 1980s. We'll encounter historical premises and topics from this book spread out in the science fiction novel Hesperus, 1981. I think he finished in 1981, but also in the enigmatic novel Tos Grec, written between 1981 and 1984, and even in some of the short stories in Le Pergamen d'Iaphon, finished in 1986 with the first edition in 1989 as La Collezione di Smeraldi, and recently retranslated beautifully by Roberta Moretti as Il Rotolo Diafano. We'll also discover a full-blown novelistic exploration of Renaissance Florence, its magic, astrology, and art of memory in the historical detective novel The Emerald Game, written together with Hilary Wisner in 1987. I will not cover all of them. I will just look at only two cases, as you see. It will take me hours to go through all of this. As a side comment, we'll probably need to add to Borges, yesterday discussed, as one of Culianu's major literary influences, that of Umberto Eco. Allusions to the name of the rose occur in the short story Il Rotolo Diafano, the second one in the collection with the same title, and royally abound in the setting and premises of The Emerald Game. Now, let's go to the second part, the ludibria, the riddles that Culianu placed in his novels and short stories. The reader must be warned, however. Culianu's texts, written in French, Italian, English, or Romanian, are charming and attractive, but they are never an easy and uncomplicated read. Culianu's literature and academic writing have in common an intricate baroque construction in which both the quick pace of the story and the elegance of the scientific argument barely hide an intricate erudite constructions. Culianu's fictions remain postmodern to its core. That is, if late 20th century postmodern writers ever admitted having one. Under the smooth surfaces of Culianu's phantasmagoric writing machine lay hidden troves of literary allusions, ranging from the Romantics to contemporary literature. There are also treasures of unexpected ludibria, that is, playthings, riddles, and mind games. One can too find lengthy metaphysical debates popping up in the most unexpected places of his arguments, and carried out to their logical and narrative exhaustion, most often than not with sharp humor and just a smidgen of sarcasm. He was that. Doors open unexpectedly in Culianu's fiction. Floor traps pull down and hallways morph into a labyrinthine construction. Prisoner in Culianu's literary castle, a castle of phantasms and irony, of illusions and allusions, of ludibria and good storytelling, the reader may never be sure that she grasped at once the whole narrative landscape in Culianu's fiction. In the remaining time of my paper, I will provide a few examples in the support of what I just said. So let's move now to the third part of the paper, the art of memory and Hesperus. We could define a little bit of technical terms. We could define the art of memory as it was developed and practiced in antiquity as a special mnemonic practice derived from training techniques developed by Greco-Roman orators and rhetors, which allowed ancient public speakers to store and retain a large number of memories. That was the artificial memory, by associating a rigorously ordered series of backgrounds and a collection of vivid images, chosen in such a way that the emotions they stir create a solid cognitive bond between backgrounds, images, and finally the very matters to be memorized. Emotions matter very much in the process of artificially remembering. Pseudo-Cicero's treatise Rhetorica ad Herenium, written in the 1st century BCE, recommends that images themselves be memorable, snapshots of actions, preferably of the kind that creates aesthetic contradictions, stirs intense feelings, unexpected mental associations, and leave a mark in the natural memory of the orator. The original ancient art of memory was thus meant as the interaction between a fixed system of places and a fluctuating system of images, connected and strengthened through visual ties between emotions and cognitions. The science fiction novel Hesperus, finished by Culianu in 1881, explores exactly this connection between emotion and cognition. The future civilization of Hesperia, established after the atomic catastrophe of 2384, and here I have to call attention to one of his ludibrium just thrown in the end of 84 at the end, 84 at the end of 2384. This civilization discovers both biological immortality through cell regeneration and the best way to abolish aggressivity by eliminating the negative emotion situated in the heart, the center of corpus subtilis, the subtle body. Purging emotions in this perfect version of future humanity results in the extinction of eros and its instincts of procreation, as described by a prophet of antiquity, Culianu quips ironically, called either Freud or Freund, and here I quote it from his book. Hesperus is chock full of ludibria, that is, riddles Culianu joyfully dropped all over the page. First, the attentive reader will recognize in the subtle body of future humanity the Aristotelian description of the pneuma, or proton organon, the astral spirit that connects body and soul, and whose description constitutes the cornerstone of eros and magic in the Renaissance, and of all the magic operations. This is page 4 in the American edition of this book. Secondly, Culianu smuggles into the literary text of Hesperus his own meditations on the role of rituals in diminishing aggressivity and negative emotions and increasing socialization, which he already delivered in his Italian essay, his 1981 Italian essay, Religione e accrescimento del potere. Thirdly, and finally, Culianu brings the novel Hesperus to its conclusion with a short chapter, the 23rd, titled after the end of Hyperborea and written in a pseudo-biblical style of gnomic expression, listing the generations of masters of the art coming out of Leicester and Linda, the main characters of Hesperus. Culianu's descriptions of the atomic catastrophe and the dawn of the new expression of humanity as the world of Hesperia pitted against the world of Hyperborea can be easily assimilated to a modern rewriting of Setian Gnostic cosmology and compared to the Manichaean eschatology of the Great Fire that will destroy the world, as it was preserved in Mani's own writing, Shaburagan, and that is in 3rd century, and probably in the early 4th century, first generation Manichaean writer sermons on the Great War. As a result, the last chapter of Hesperus can be best read as Culianu's serious parody, Iocari serio, of course, of the ancient Setian Gnostic rewriting of the book of Genesis. There are doors that open toward other doors. Let's move now to the 4th section of my talk: magic and the diaphanous pergament. His collection of short stories. What is magic? Defining magic has become a minefield in academic writings over the last 3 or 4 decades. We heard today a very good paper on that approximated exactly this by Bada. A plethora of definitions exist side by side with no definitions at all to escape this dispute still raging in the academia, which ranges from: do we call it magic? Do we protect the word with quotation marks? Magic. Do we protect ourselves with quotation marks against the power of the word? Magic. Do we call them rituals of power? Is magic not religion? We'll only deal here only with Culianu's own definitions of magic. To simplify the argument for the sake of brevity, you already heard a paper on this topic. Let's say that the reader will discover magic in Culianu's academic books in mostly 2 flavors: Ficinian magic, which is benign, Platonic, astrologic, and deeply erudite, and Brunian magic, Saturnian, melancholic, binding, and controlling. In Ioan Petru Culianu's academic text, magic remains the art of creating, inducing, entertaining, and enhancing bits of visionary episodes or successions of phantasm. This bit calls for my repeating it. It's essential. In Ioan Petru Culianu's academic text, magic remains the art of creating, of inducing, entertaining, and enhancing bits of visionary episodes or successions of phantasms. In Culianu's fictions, on the other hand, magic acquires elements of traditional fantastic fables, and it is further enhanced by Culianu's own anthropological reconstruction of what it really meant to be a magician in the Renaissance. We have the whole novel, The Emerald Game, as a witness to that. For instance, mental abilities sharpened beyond normal bent natural laws in the novel Hesperus. The same mental powers create binding visions in the short story about the theft of monastic visions, Il Rotolo Diafano. These stories about a whole monastery whose monks were suddenly unable to have personal night visions after Christmas includes a beautiful ludibrium pointing us to the historical core of the argument of Eros and magic in the Renaissance, about the censorship of European imagination in the wake of Reformation. Another short story in the 1986-1989 collection, Le Pergament Diaphane, The Master of Sound, contains a full package of ludibria, of riddles. It is the story of the metempsychosis of the Master of Sound through the bodies of various pseudo-historical characters. It might be here the place to say that Ioan Petru Culianu had a minor pet peeve, that is, an intense dislike for the use of the word metempsychosis, which he found it erroneous. He holds that the soul transmigrates through different bodies, not the other way around. Culianu mentions this twice in his fictions and several times in his academic texts. Going back to the story, in The Master of the Sound, Said ibn Misjah learns how to grow plants in the desert with the mere power of the sound. After he dies, he moved into the body of Al-Mawsili, which could influence emotions, perform miracles of nature, and even bring the dead back to life. Next in the list of this process of metempsychosis is the body of Alkinde, the real 9th century author of the magic treatise De Radiis on the stellar rays. Before mastering the art of the sound, Culianus Alkinde experienced a personal crisis. He asked himself, and here I quote my translation from Romanian from the Polyroma edition, page 39. What is the true substance of the world? Isn't it ultimately just a pure phantasmagory initiated by my own intellect? And if that is the case, does that make me in each moment the only creator of the world? Desperate that he cannot find, and here I quote again, the relations between his own intellect and the world, I close my quote, Alkinde decides to commit suicide. He climbs a rock by the sea and is about to throw himself in the waters below when an odd character called Kadir stops him from suicide and initiates him into the, I quote again, the mysteries of the jinns, the spirits, and of the three-shaped powers. Again, a ludibrium. The historian of ancient Gnosis will no doubt recognize in the palimpsest of the above literary portrait of Alkinde the figure of Zostrianus, the literary protagonist of the 3rd or 4th century Coptic text. Is a translation of a Greek text with the same name, discovered together with the other texts at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. In his 1984 Experience de l'Extase, Ioan Petru Culianu remarks that the narrative framework of Zostrianus reads like the biography of any ancient philosophy professor, frustrated that his daily intellectual intake of reading, lecturing, and discussing about invisible realities does not quite live up to his own direct experience of them. This is in the French edition of page 12, the French 1984 edition. In the Coptic dialogue, Zostrianus' efforts to teach Platonic ontology by the book amounted to no good avail. Zostrianus, in the ancient text, could not find his own place among his supposed peers. He wanted more information, and he wanted directly from its ontological source, the highest divinity. In the ancient text, Zostrianus pushes the boundaries of his own mental improvement and proceeds to explore further invisible realities on his own. Unguided, he provisionally strengthens his visionary powers and, in his search for the ultimate level of divinity, accidentally cites an unresponsive lower authority, the perfect child, or according to John Turner, scholar of Nakamadi text, the triple male child, a resident of the Barbello Ioan. So here we have the reference to the triple four. A teacher of popular Platonic philosophy, Zostrianus bangs his head against the same wall of aporias discussed in Plato's latest dialogue, Parmenides, about the participation, ancient Greek metexis, of the individual forms to the world of the eternal ideas. Since his harsh asceticism and philosophical diligence did not lead him anywhere, Zostrianus, in the ancient text, decides that a life bounded in a world of meaningless sensations and unsolved Platonic aporias is not worth living at all. His search came to a dead end, and Zostrianus decided he himself must as well. I quote now from John Turner's translation from Coptic, which I change a little bit. As for me, Zostrianus says, I did not stop seeking the place of rest worthy of my spirit, where I would not be bound in the perceptible world. Then, as I was deeply troubled and gloomy because of the discouragement that surrounded me, I dared to act and to deliver myself to the wild beast of the desert for violent death. Zostrianus would have succeeded to kill himself, no doubt, had it not been for the angel of knowledge, angel of Gnosis, who rescues him and takes him in an ecstatic trip to heavens, where he received the answers to his Platonic questions in the guise of a revelation. I quote again from John Turner's translations of Zostrianus. There stood before me the angel of the knowledge of eternal light, and he said to me, Zostrianus, why have you gone mad as though you were ignorant of the great eternal beings who are above? You have a divine angel that has shown you the way for holy persons. Come and transcend these realms. When he said this to me, I very eagerly and gladly embarked with him upon a great luminous cloud and left my molded bodily form upon the earth, guarded by glories, a true experience del extase by the book. Now I come to the conclusion, into the fifth part of my talk. We let ourselves be enchanted by all this gorgeous images of and riddles Ioan Petru Culianu waved through his text. But 40 years after they were written, how are we to understand Culianu's Ludibria, his riddles in his fiction? How should we critically evaluate the intertwined search for advanced philosophical education, which is intimately associated with the corresponding religious experiences in the case of the Gnostic Zostrianus, Culianu's literary alkindi, and finally, ultimately, Culianu himself? As a preliminary answer, and as a historian of religion, I would suggest regarding the 1980s as both the climax period and the last decade of the phenomenological school in the history of religion, as it was envisaged by Mircea Eliade. The history of religion in the 1980s granted a privileged position to religious experience. It also lent religious experience a heightened role in the process of the epistemological validation of religious knowledge and its structure. In a recent set of articles published last year in the journal Asdivar, Professor Mariana Ferrara from the Sapienza University of Rome and I have shown that this perspective gained a great deal of influence in the history of religion in mid-20th century Europe with the Erasmus meetings at Ascona in Switzerland, under the theoretical auspices of Carl Gustav Jung and Rudolf Otto. Together with Moshe Idel and Fritz Graf, Mariana Ferrara and I suggested that this was determined by a close association between the academic history of religion and the analytical techniques of personal self-improvement and care for souls in the Jungian analytical tradition. All four Asdivar articles will become available online in a few months. As a response to these experiential perspectives, the 1980s also witnessed the first books about the insider-outsider issue in the history of religions, and also a plethora of discussions about the tensions between emic, inside, and ethic, outside perspectives. How do we talk about religious experience from inside or from outside? These conversations culminated in the 1990s and coincided with the methodological and historiographical contestations of Mircea Eliade's schools. Finally, to return to the topic of the talk today. Ioan Petru Culianu wrote his fictions as a postmodern, equally ludic and ironic companion to his academic research. He envisaged his novels as personal and quasi-anthropological explorations of the world of the Renaissance magicians. He dared to ask how was really, what was really like to be a magician in the Renaissance. He played his passions for the life of the mind as serious as possible, and deployed serious efforts in hiding his riddles in all the nooks and crannies of his fictions. Io care serio studio sissime luderi. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eduard. I really enjoyed this presentation because, in fact, it somehow dramatized the basic skills that anyone needs in order to approach Culianu's work. So somebody who is capable of revisiting a a translation from Coptic into English, or reread Nag Hammadi texts in general against the background of whatever Culianu has written, really deserves some our kind attention. There is a very important point that was made here, among other points. To the end, precisely the general transformation in the field of history of religion as a discipline in the period of the 1980s and the 1990s. And the fact that Culianu had to himself rethink for himself and for colleagues with whom he was interacting, the bottom line of history of religions as a discipline has indeed, how shall I say, stimulated him to go as far as he went throughout the 1980s, and through his projects to look even further, turned out after his death, into the fundamental methodological, theoretical issues that central categories in the history of religion, such as, for instance, religious experience itself, central categories had to be reconsidered, rethought, and both in his scholarship and, unlike most other scholars who do not write scholarship, in his literary work, Culianu has experimented, has theorized, has tried to work and rework these categories. So thank you very much. We move on now to the second presentation by Igor Tavilla, under the title A Synoptic Look at Culianu's Trees, in the plural, Trees of Gnosis. Igor Tavilla, besides being interested in Culianu, and besides working on topics in the intellectual history and history of ideas of the interwar period, with special attention to the work of the likes of Ionescu himself and Eliade, is a Kierkegaard scholar. Once again, we see that when we come to encounter the work of Culianu, we have to bring a multitude of different experiences from different academic skills, different background, because knowledge in this sense and interpretation in this situation are entirely based on recognition. As every form of knowledge is a form of recognition, this is even more the case when we try to interpret a theoretical work, a scholarly work, and the fictional work that are replete with extremely learned references, ideas, suggestions, and so forth. So, in other words, the competent reader of such a complex writer has to bring their best to the discussion of Culianu. And in this case, and in the reading of Ionescu, Igor Tavilla has brought Kierkegaard. Of course, because Ionescu's and other people's trăirism, experientialism, which is a kind of radical form of proto-existentialism, in itself raises issues that I think are common with those raised by the complex fiction and scholarly work of Culianu. So, Igor, Tavilla, if you are anywhere there on Zoom, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wish to thank Professor Antohi for the opportunity of speaking. I'm honored and delighted to be part of this conference, and I want to greet also all the participants in the conference. I don't like to play defense, but since the very beginning, I wish to make clear that you could have two good reasons for complaining me. And the first one is that I'm not a Culianist in the strict sense of the term, since my interest in Culianu's work is relatively recent. I'm trying to become Culianu's scholar, and so I feel like a neophyte compared to you all. And B, which is possibly even worse, I'm not an historian of religion. My background is basically philosophical, focused on philosophy of religion. So some of the conclusion that I will draw at the end of my speech could sound a little bit too far from the subject which I actually choose for my presentation. That is Culianu's interpretation of Western dualism from I miti dei dualismi occidentali, 1989, through Le Gnose dualiste d'Occident, 1990, up to the Tree of Gnosis. I will help myself by reading a few notes and sharing with you some slides that I prepared. Just a second. Okay. Okay. Can you see it? Okay. And so this short speech responds to the invitation of Sorin and Antohi to develop some considerations that I made in the margins of the foreword to the Tree of Gnosis, which has been recently published in Italian translation by the Italian-Romanian online journal Orizzonti Culturali Italo-Romeni. The work in question, the Tree of Gnosis, is still unknown in all the countries excepting Romania, since the only existing translations of it has been published by Polyrom in 2005. For space-time reasons, it is not possible for me to cover the entire span of Culianu's production devoted to deepening the religious phenomenon called dualism. As it is known, Culianu's interest in the subjects dates back to his stay at the Catholic University of Milan, where he arrived after many vicissitudes in 1973. Under the guidance of Ugo Bianchi, the young Romanian scholar converted from Indology to the history of early Christianity and Western dualisms, even it was only an half conversion, meaning that, to use Culianu's same words, a partial adherence to Bianchi's opinions. Here, I will limit myself to recording the main transformation that have occurred in the so-called last Culianu, ultimul Culianu, to quote Patapievich, or American Culianu, to quote Muscheidel, which is generally considered as a turning point in his interpretation of Western dualisms. The Romanian historian of religions would have passed from a philological historical approach to the phenomenon of gnosis to a cognitive one, according to which religious systems would be nothing more than ideal objects whose functioning and reproduction are run by a mental program which tends to implement all its infinite possible variation. I will go straight to 1987, the year in which Culianu obtained the prestigious Doctorat d'État under the guidance of Michel Mislin, professor of comparative history of religion and former supervisor of his first Parisian doctorate, 3e cycle. The thesis was discussed at the Sorbonne, but was actually concluded in Wassenaar, The Hague, while the author benefited from a fellowship, the NIAS, Netherlands Institutes for Advanced Study. The same year, the Gnose Dualiste Occident was already in preparation at Payot Publishing House. By the way, Payot was the editor of Mircea Eliade and the publishing house where Culianu himself had published Expérience de l'Estase. But there were some internal issues that caused the director and owner, Jean-Luc Pidou-Payot, to leave his publishing house and move as director at Plon. Being a good friend of him, Culianu followed Pidou-Payot to Plon, where the French edition was finally released in 1990, 1 year after the first Italian translation, I miti dei dualismi occidentali, which therefore becomes the starting point, the point of departure of my speech. There is no difference between the Italian translation and the French edition, except for the addition of a new foreword. If we compare the two prefaces, that of the Italian translation, dated Wassenaar, 11 November 1986, appears to be an ordinary foreword, in which Culianu settles his debt of gratitude with the various masters he met along his training path. Ugo Bianchi, who initiated the young Romanian scholar to the history of Western dualisms, Michel Mislin, supervisor of his French doctorates, and finally, last but not least, Mircea Eliade, who, among other things, facilitated his arrival in the United States at the Divinity School of Chicago, where Eliade himself taught continuously since the autumn of 1956. In the preface to the French edition, dated Chicago, 19 September 1989, Culianu takes up only partly the content of the previous preface, also mentioning the existence of the Italian translation, of course, and the echoes aroused by the publication of the Italian and English editions of Eros et Magie à la Renaissance. In passing, Culianu jokes on some critical reviews that have defined him as a, I quote, suspicious structuralist, a pluralist without half measures, advocate of certain dubious mental and social freedoms, and at the same time, he is pleased to have enjoyed the favor of a vast audience of qualified readers, including Eleni Rezzolla and Grazia Marchiano. In the meanwhile, Culianu translated and rewrote his work with Hilary S. Wiesner, and in 1992, the publisher HarperCollins of New York published posthumously The Tree of Gnosis, Gnostic Mythology from Early Christianity to Modern Nihilism. As specified in the colophon, it is a completely revised translation of the materials collected in Le Gnose Dualiste Occident. Particularly, the new preface can be read as a programmatic manifesto of the cognitive turn matured by the last Culianu, in line with the essay System and History, published in the first issue of the magazine Incognita, founded by Culianu himself in 1990, and considered by Sorin Antohi the epistemological manifesto of Culianu, and for the author's tragic end, also his testament. In presenting his work to the American audience, on the one hand, Culianu hopes that historical studies will be able to renew their epistemology in the light of the paradigm change that have occurred in other domains of human knowledge, especially in the field of physics and cosmology. On the other hand, he underlines the diversity of approach that distinguishes his proposal from the structuralist one. While the structuralist thinks, in fact, in purely morphological terms, Culianu intends to place the morphology of religious system into the diachrony of history. The result is a morphodynamic approach in which ideal objects are seen in their space-time evolution. It will suffice here to provide just a couple of examples of the main structural and methodological differences that exist between the traditions, testifying to a continuous work of thought, translation, and writing that has progressively led the author to the results mentioned above. In the introduction to I miti dei dualismi occidentali, the author presents his work as a comparative analysis of Western dualisms and their mythological structures. Culianu is skeptical about the possibility of attributing common traits to the dualism, such as anti-cosmism, anti-somatism, encretism, vegetarianism, and so on, due to the spectrum of tolerance that characterizes it. That is the capacity of the various Gnostic trends to include, reject, and variously combine this or that aspect without thereby losing the common denominator of Gnosticism, which is the opposition between two principles. According to Culianu, Gnosticism can be seen as a unitary phenomenon, not in positive terms, but by contrast to the mainstream religious systems, given the denial of the two principles which were common to the religious background of that time, namely the principle of ecosystemic intelligence. It has the world is ruled by a providential order, and by the anthropic principle. It has the world is created on a human scale to the measure of man. The production rule underlying Gnostic mythology consists then in the interaction of two myths independent for each other, the myth of fallen wisdom and the myth of the ignorant demiurge, and their application to a third myth, the myth of the biblical Genesis, according to an hermeneutical approach that Culianu calls inverse exegesis. Let's now take a look at the introduction to the Tree of Gnosis. The text opens with a reflection on the difficulty experienced by Albert Einstein in the first person of making ordinary people participate in the astonishing consequences of his theory of general relativity, which Culianu held responsible for the affirmation of the cognitive paradigm. The attempt made by the German physicist to offer an exposition of the theory to the general understanding was bound to lead to a general misunderstanding, because what Einstein spoke about was too far beyond sensible experience and to the imaginative power of a profane mind. Culianu takes up and develops the Einsteinian reference to Flatland, a romance with many dimensions by Edwin A. Abbott, the novel in which the inhabitants of a two-dimensional world experience the insurmountable difficulty of imagining a reality in three dimensions. On his turn, the Romanian scholar proposes an example along the lines of Abbott's work, that of a spoon that is dipped in a dish of soup, and that the inhabitants who live on the surface of the soup perceive as a sequence of phenomena over time. At the basis of this explanatory model, which he defines as a cognitive, lies the intuition that ideas are synchronic and part of a system which in itself constitutes an ideal object, operating in its own dimension, the logical dimension, whose functioning depends on a few simple premises, starting from which it produces infinite possible solutions. When the system intersects the space-time dimension, it fragments and multiplies, giving rise to a sequence of space-time events without being possible, however, to establish a relationship of direct descent, a lineage between them. The scholar is therefore unable to fully understand the origin and especially the kinship relationship between historical facts as long as he ignores the three-dimensionality of the ideal object of which historical facts are only sections. I will skip then to the 10th chapter, corresponding actually to the 11th of the previous editions, entitled The Tree of Gnosis, in place of I Dualismi Occidentali, un'analisi sincronica. Culianu preserves Yeats' quote and the opening words, in which he mentions the habit of a famous gangster of 1930s to make decisions by throwing a coin in the air. The myth, Gnostic myth, just like the aforementioned gangster, offers an example of a multiple choice mechanism. This is the case of Gnosticism, which has gone through all the possible variants offered by the starting question, unde malum? Culianu rejects as immoral the existential interpretation which states that Gnosticism is basically due to a crisis, whatever it means, and separates what he calls the social history of the phenomenon from the intrinsic logic of the Gnostic system, which was not a bad game in itself, but was a serious game, and although it was stopped by force. Culianu considers the Gnostics as champions of free thought, and he observes that if they had prevailed in history, their logical system would have been paradoxically impoverished, since it would have consolidated only one variant rather than run the entire spectrum of its possibilities. The generative system of Gnosticism appears therefore as a tree, the tree of Gnosis, and its morphogenesis can be understood in terms of a logical board game in which each square offers multiple choices. The board game can theoretically expand itself endlessly, and Culianu adds, played a game, played all, because each game, whatever it is, reflects the functioning of human mind. The Tree of Gnosis ends with an eloquent epilogue entitled Games People Play. Culianu states in clear terms that theological disputes that animated early Christianity were nothing more than mental games, not different from chess, perhaps only less complicated, in which none of the contenders could checkmate the opponent, and that had nothing to do with the logic of power that were acted out in their name and which led to the physical and moral destruction of many. Similarly, Gnosticism was a mind game that superimposed itself on early Christianity and used many elements coming from this latter to reproduce itself. Culianu goes further, stating that mental games, be they religious, philosophical, scientific, have necessarily similar mechanisms due to the conservative structure of the human mind, so that the same questions faced in the context of ancient Christianity and Gnosticism are bound to recur again and again on other game tables. The formal superimpositions of mental games could in the long run prove to be a substantial superimposition. It could be virtually possible so to demonstrate the coincidence of the Buddhist system with the Christian one, or with that of German idealistic philosophy, validating in fact the convergence or the unity of all the philosophical and religious traditions about which much has been speculated for a long time. Regarding the fact that belief systems could be negatively affected by the cognitive approach, Culianu observes instead that they are strengthening, since cognitivism shows quite clearly that there is no antithesis between religious and science, and not even between one religion and the other, opening the perspective of an ecumenical and inclusive religiosity, opposite to fundamentalist particularism, whose threat to the Western civilization Culianu falls so well in advance. Now, I would like to hazard a few observations, which in part would serve as a conclusion, and in part would like to broaden the field of reflection for a possible research. The Tree of Gnosis is about 2/3 the same book and 1/3 a different book. To use the image dear to Culianu of the intellectual bricks, we could say that Culianu's work is substantially the same as regards the construction materials, but these materials are differently arranged in order to respond, I believe, to the following needs. A, facilitating reading, reducing the number of scholarly references and giving a less academic but more informative cut to its exposition. The book loses the form of a doctoral thesis and becomes masterpiece of scholarship, to quote Umberto Eco. And B, better explaining the epistemology of his own research, resulting in a sort of book manifesto. And C, satisfying the taste of cultivated non-European audience, which likes to be amused as well as educated. Hence the frequent references to literature, psychoanalysis, and movies. Having said that, it seems to me that in the Tree of Gnosis, the Platonic lineage of Gnosticism is more heavily emphasized, while the focus shifts from dualism as Gnosis' distinctive traits to the exegetical principle which lies on the basis of Gnostic hermeneutic, considered in the broad tree-shaped spectrum of its logical possibilities. In conclusion, I would like to point out the self-interpretative or self-explanatory character of cognitive theory. If religious systems are, as well as philosophical and scientific systems, ideal objects, we are led to believe that the interpretations of religious systems might also be considered as ideal objects that cross the surface of time, determining a series of sections whose sequential order we understand, but whose three-dimensionality still missing us. The question then arises, what mental game, what mind game did Culianu play? What is the production rule and morphodynamic of his cognitive system? To use the flatland metaphor, I would say that Culianu has moved along the unilinear dimension of historical philosophical research, and then he has shifted to a three-dimensional space represented by the logic of religious systems. But at this point, we experience the same restless curiosity of the square protagonist of Flatland, who begs the sphere, I quote, to take his servant on a second journey into the blessed region of the fourth dimension and see, end of quote, and see the inside of each three-dimensional system of ideas that is, outside of metaphor, the internal side of the cognitive interpretation of religion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you very much. It was a very precious attempt to see in the slides and then in the more dramatic differences between the editions of the same book, ways of access to the birth of this thought of Culianu about the mind games. And indeed, I think we should try to somehow be able to reconstruct the way Culianu was imagining this process of generation. Because sometimes I would say there is a problem with this dualism, with this binary system. Binary systems are okay, offering very, let's say, the bottom line of a generative rule that from simple 0-1 choices generates an extraordinarily and potentially infinitely ramifying tree. But there are phenomena, I would claim, which I think challenge this the original binary system. So when thinking about this system of generating infinite systems of possibilities using very simple rules, the fractal metaphor here has been used and abused. I'm also thinking of, let's say, more traditional forms of imagining the possibility of the existence of things that do not, categories, for instance, or entities that we do not identify empirically. And sometimes we cannot predict according to generative simple rules that, however, become predictable in a more complex way. And the example that I would give here is the classic Mendeleev's table, in which a system of, let's say, wild guessing the plausibility of elements that are not yet discovered, but still are being possible or could be conjectured based on more complicated rules, not on simple binary rules, helps us somehow to relativize this vision of an ever-branching tree. So I would say that we have to imagine that the roots themselves ramify, branch out infinitely, and they also can be located simultaneously in several dimensions and in several logics of growth, and be, let's say, subject and the object of, simultaneously, of different generation rules, generative rules, even binary. So because 0-1 has also to be defined locally. This is not just an abstract mind game, but it is also a way of looking at existing objects and establishing a system by which they can be organized, predicted, imagined. So I think there is a lot of potential in the, how shall I put it, in the re-examination, rereading of this standard Culianu metaphor, if you want, or working metaphor of the tree of Gnosis. I think this can in itself be further complicated. We do not handle very complicated systems very easily, but I think that at least the possibility of generating more complicated systems should be there, left open. So this is how I would look into the problem of the trees of Gnosis, multiplying the dimensions in which they exist simultaneously and multiplying the directions and also the rules. Binary is one thing, but there is a qualitative definition of what it is that the binary system generates, which elements we decide that can be placed in binary opposition. This is also a choice. These binary oppositions do not exist outside of our mind and irrespective of the systems and the rules we choose to use. So I think this calls for a more complex, how shall I say, rereading of the whole vision of the tree of Gnosis. I hope sometime in the future somebody will take this up from other scholarly disciplines where I don't know where from. Now, we turn to the third presentation by Horia Corneliu Cicortaș. These are remarks on the literary fortune of Ioan Petru Culianu. Now, Horia Corneliu Cicortaș is a wandering Romanian, very much like Eduard Iricinschi, but who decided to settle in Italy. This is the kind of Romanian in Italy about whom you never get anything in the news. I have to tell you, people are generally not interested in scholars. They do not make it in the news unless they are killed, for instance. Horia Corneliu Cicortaș has worked tremendously over many years after his studies, which he completed with a PhD at the University of Naples, L'Orientale, working on especially Eliade. When Horia Corneliu Cicortaș picked up the topic of Culianu, Ioan Petru Culianu, then he engaged in a very, very ambitious program of promoting Culianu's work and works in Italy, trying to persuade publishers to discover or rediscover, and most importantly, to publish and republish Culianu's works. And part of his work of promotion of Culianu's work, as we know, went into the splendid special issue of Antares dedicated to Culianu that he has realized together with Roberta Moretti and with Andrea Scarabelli. So, Horia, if you are there, if you are ready.
Yes.
Okay, then please go ahead. Hello,
okay.
Welcome and go ahead.
Hello to everybody. I thank Sorin and Antohi for inviting me to this conference, which unfortunately I cannot attend in person. So the topic of my communication concerns the literary fortune of Ioan Petru Culianu. The final form of this text will be prepared for the proceedings, since this research is very extensive and still in progress. So speaking of literary fortune means in particular addressing three major issues: the diffusion of Culianu's scholarly and fictional writings, the critical reception, and Culianu as a literary character in the fictional works of other authors. So I will focus only on the most important works of Culianu published as volumes, as books, during his life and aftermath, focusing on the languages in which they were originally written, the countries in which they were published, and the publishing houses involved. Of course, concerning the diffusion and reception of Culianu's works, a special role, we can say a happy exception, a real oasis, is represented by Romania. As we know, in Romania, his oeuvre has been systematically published, starting from the 90s with the Nemira Publishing House, and after 2000 at the Polyrom Publishing House. We can remember here and underline that only a part of these works were written in Romanian. Most of them are written in other languages, especially French, English, and Italian. So what means this? It means that most of the volumes in the Biblioteca Ioan Petru Culianu, Polyrom Publishing House, in this series are translations into Romanian of works, published or unpublished, which were written in other languages. That's why the Romanian case is a special case, as the situation of Culianu's works abroad is very different from that existing in Romania. I will mention the Romanian editions only to highlight some problems and hardships relating to the foreign works. So let's see the works and the editions. Some of these works are the result of different dissertations. Actually, there are 4, 2 degrees and 2 PhD dissertations. So the first one is the Romanian degree on 1972 on Marsilio Ficino e i problemi del Rinascimento, which is in Italian and which is still unpublished in Italian. It's interesting that some Western scholars quoted it because they had access to it when Culianu managed to recover it from Romania. It was translated only into Romanian, Polyrom 2015. The second one is the 1976 Italian degree on Gnosticism and Ioannis, which was published as book in 1985 in Italian also, and it is translated only in Romanian. So we have the French PhD Troisième cycle Sorbonne, 1980, and we have 2 books from this dissertation. We have Psyche and Odia in English, Brill, 1983, translated only into Romanian, and Expérience de l'Extase, PO, 1984, translated in different languages, also not only in Italian and Spanish, for instance, but also in Japanese. And finally, we have the Doctorat d'État, 1987, at the same university, Sorbonne, with the book that was told by Igor before, Les Gnoses dualistes, translated into Italian first, I miti dei dualismi occidentali, and after that, the transformation of this book, the avatar of this book into the tree of Gnosis. So Culianu's debut should have taken place in 1971, but not with a scholarly book, with a collection of short stories entitled The Art of Escape. Much of these narratives had appeared in literary magazines during the period in which Culianu was a student, but the volume, ready for printing at that time, was blocked after Culianu, approached by a Securitate officer, refused the invitation to collaborate and began to feel the weight of the regime's censorship. So shortly after Marsilio Ficino's graduation in Bucharest in June 1972, Culianu left Romania and went to Perugia, where he had won a scholarship, like in the previous year, in which he has not allowed to get out from the country. So he studied from 1973 with Ugo Bianchi in Milan, leaving his Indian studies to devote himself to Gnosticism, but continued, for instance, the relationship with Mircea Eliade, on whom he began to write a synthetic monograph. He got the 2nd degree at the Catholic University of Milan. He lived in the Domus Nostra University residence in Via Necchi 9, where he made friendship with Romanato and others, but where in the same years another Romanian scholar was hosted, that was the Orthodox priest Traian Valdman, which is still pastor of the first Romanian Orthodox parish in Milan. But they were not friends, Culianu and Valdman. In the autumn of 1976, he left Italy to move to University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where he has given a job as lecturer in Romanian language and literature. It will remain there for 10 years. It is during the Dutch years that Culianu published the first two books, both in Italian. He started to prepare these books, but they were published only when he was in Groningen. So in the spring of 1978, he published the volume Mircea Eliade, the first monograph of Eliade written by a Romanian in Assisi for Cittadella Editrice. I mentioned here that there is a second monograph written by a Romanian, the literary critic Adrian Marino, who was published in Romania 2 years after that, in 1980, and was immediately translated into French. This was the L'Herméneutique de Mircea Eliade, Gallimard, 1981. This first Italian book of Culianu, sympathetic with Eliade, but with some critical remarks, have been appreciated by Eliade, who at first hoped for its translation into French or English, or French and English. Unfortunately, despite being known, quoted and discussed, especially in Italy, it has never been translated into any language except Romanian. In Romanian, the first Nemira edition is from 1995, and the last edition is of 2022, very recent. However, the Romanian editions contain also other texts of Culianu on Eliade, of which only a couple were written in Romanian. The others were written in French and Italian. So they were translated into Romanian and published with the Italian text. And we have to remember that there is also a second Italian edition from 2008, unfortunately published by a very marginal publishing house, the same that also published that Anton's book. So I can show you here, for instance, this is the first one, the first edition, 1978. And this is the second edition from the same Settimo Sigillo publishing house. In 1981, in Messina, the volume Iter in Silvis first part was published with the subtitle Selected Essays on Gnosis. So again, in Italian. Appreciated by Italian scholars, it had little circulation because of the niche publishing house. It will be translated into Romanian and completed with Iter in Silvis 2. And it is the second of Culianu's Italian books, no longer reprinted. Also in the same year, 1981, together with former faculty colleagues Romanato and Lombardo, he wrote the book Religione e Potere. On his very insightful essay, Religion and Increase of Power. For instance, Professor Filoramo, who is still a professor of history of Christianity, wrote very positively. And Filoramo, by the way, has also reviewed other Italian books of Culianu. This volume is also out of print in Italy and has been only translated in Romania. So the same thing, the Dutch book of 1983, published in English, which has a broader complement, published in French, L'expérience de l'extase, This time was printed by Payot, a French publishing house with a very strong impact on the market. So this is the first French book of Culianu, and very important, of course, is a result of the first doctoral dissertation of 1980. This French book, along with the other French book published in 1984 by Flammarion, Eros et Magie à la Renaissance, bring Culianu on the international academic stage. This book of on Renaissance was the Culianu's first and most influential book published in the United States in 1987, so in the very year in which he began his career as a professor in Chicago. The third Italian book, 1985, published by Erma di Breschneider in Rome on Hans Jonas, was published by a very prestigious publishing house, a sort of Italian Brill, but remained restrained to niche academic discussion and was never been republished. In the meantime, in 1987, Culianu traveled in Italy with Hilary Weissner. He wrote in English the novel The Emerald Game, set in Florence during the Renaissance. Still unpublished in English, it was printed only in Romanian translation. And Les Gnoses Dualistes was ready since 1987, was announced by Payot, but was first published in Italian translation in 1989, the year of Culianu's literary debut, also at the Iași Book Publishing House with La Collezione di Smeraldi. This was the first fictional book of Culianu in Italy. We have to do that. It was the posthumous American avatar of the last French book of Culianu, Gnosis, the Tree of Gnosis, which attracted more critical interest and reviews, as well as the book written on 1991, Out of This World. So let's see now the critical reception. Thanks to the recent Elena Bondo's Culianu bibliography of over 1,000 pages in 2 volumes that deal with the works and the critical reception, we have now a valid and useful tool for realize the range of the entire oeuvre of Culianu, including his unpredictable literary fortune. As Giovanni Casadio said in one of his articles, Culianu ou de la contradiction, the paradox of the so-called last Culianu or American Culianu consists in the fact that despite he became a potential planetary guru, there were a severe reaction from the academic circles treated by the Romanian author, by Culianu, with a certain presumption that might have seemed cynical, often paid back with an attitude of envy and snobbishness. We know, however, as in fact yesterday confirmed Pablo Moret, that at the University of Chicago there was a sort of cancellation against the scholar who, in any case, were a professor of that university and were killed, and who was killed in that campus for reasons connected with his philosophical and political views. Teresa Culianu Petrescu, in her essay, A Biography, rightly records the existence of a cabinet of death active in Romania since 1990, that is, after the fall of Ceausescu, until August 1991, Well, this deadline, August 1991, seems important to me. What happens in August 1991? The Soviet Union has fallen, whose old splendor somebody now in Moscow are trying to restore. We know how. And in the spring of 1991, when the former Romanian King Michael went to visit Chicago, welcomed by Culianu, who was by no means a monarchist, the then president of Romania, Ioan, signed a treaty of friendship with the USSR. In Romania, the old communist constitution was still in force. Fortunately, that treatise was no longer ratified after the fall of USSR. Remembering these events helped us maybe to understand the whole context in which, in the last 2 years of his life, Culianu acts also as a political journalist, and help us to understand that mythical dimension that is formed around him immediately after his death, as Umberto Eco noted, also thanks to the crime that remained unsolved and unpunished. In the critical reception of Culianu's books, translated or published in the USA, Eros and Magic, Out of This World, The Tree of Gnosis, we must also include the broad echo of the Dictionary of Religions, first published in French and signed together with Mircea Eliade, but of which he was, Culianu, in fact, the only editor, only author. This is at the moment his most translated volume in all the world. The list of American reviews to these volumes, these 3 volumes, except the Dictionary of Religions, often signed by university professors, is quite long and varies from very favorable ones, often signed by women, to full slurs with many intermediate situations, which includes both the qualities and the limits of the Romanian scholars' works. Yet, after Culianu's death, the publication of these works has slowed down, even in the countries with which he has had the closest relationships, such as Italy, and where, as we have seen, Culianu made his debut both as a scientific, as a scholarly author, and as an author of fiction. In fact, on the back cover of La Collezione Smeraldi, here, the novel Hesperus was announced but no longer published. Hesperus was written by Culianu, was another novel, was written by Culianu in 1980 in Romanian and translated by himself for Iași book. We have a copy of this translation, but it's not clear whether it will be published or not. Maybe, we hope so, by Edizioni Bietti. By the way, the Rotolo Diafano, Il Rotolo Diafano, edited by Roberta Moretti, was published. This is a transformation of this one, no? Was published by Elliott Publishing House in Rome. Beautiful edition on 2010, but it remains still the unique volume of Culianu printed by this publisher. So it's not simple to propose the new volumes or or to republish the old volumes. But I think this one is, for instance, in available as ebook. I think, yes, in ebook and also as print edition. Other volumes as I Viaggi dell'Anima, that is Out of This World, or Le Esperienze dell'Estasi have not been reprinted despite an initial bookstore success. The only Italian book that was still available after the 90s was Eros e Magia di Nascimento. This is the first edition of Saggiatore. The last one is Bolati Boringhieri. And as I already said, the second edition of the 1978 volume on Mircea Eliade was published by an obscure publishing house in 2008. However, recently, when Linda Publishing House of Torino printed my translation of Iogari Sirio, this is the volume, something moved here in Italy. A year later, the Iaca Book Publishing House republished I Miti dei Dualismi Occidentali. This is the new Iaca Book edition. And recently, it came out in a third edition by Rusconi Libri. So we have this sequence, from 2017, 2018. Now this volume, but of course, we have to say that last year, 2021, we published that special Antares issue, which which includes many unpublished and or difficult to find texts in Italian. So this is briefly the situation in Italy. I must tell you that for me, the most disappointing case among the various countries where Culianu's books have been published so far is that of France. In France, in fact, Culianu published the books that made him famous worldwide. In 1984, 2 books, and in 1990, 2 books, including the dictionary. Except the dictionary, none of these French books have since been republished. None of these 3 books. Now, about the reason, the possible reasons of this silence, this French silence, of this curious damnatio memoriae, so far I have only few ideas which I can summarize in 2 starting assumptions. First, Culianu's editorial contacts mediated by Eliade vanished after Eliade's death on 1986. At the same time, Eliade's memory, we know that, was increasingly attacked for political reasons, and also his prestige as a scholar of religions was increasingly criticized. Second, Culianu had much less contacts and friendships in academic circles in France than in other countries such as Italy, Germany, or the United States. To these 2 biographical reasons, we must add those regarding his scholarly ideas and vision. For this purpose, more in-depth research still needs to be done on the reception of Culianu's works in French-speaking area. Just to give an example, in the second volume of the newly published bibliography, no French review of Eros et Magie à la Renaissance is recorded. Probably those reviews that still exist in some way have been gone unnoticed in this curious silence. Even in the United States, Culianu's books are not systematically reprinted. However, they are still available if you refer to the two of the 3 books mentioned above. I mean, Eros and Magic and Out of This World. While the Tree of Gnosis seems to be currently out of business. Finally, to conclude these brief remarks, I would like to mention the curious case and positive case for me of the Japanese market, where Eros and Magic, as early as 1991, so when Culianu was still alive, and Experience de l'Extase in 2 editions, one of which is very recent, has been translated. but also, and this is the very interesting point, they published also in Japanese from Romanian the correspondence with Eliade. So far, only published in Romanian, Dialoguri Întrerupte, second edition to 2014. So now the third and final aspect of these remarks, Culianu as fictional character. The third and final aspect of Culianu's literary fortune, on which I would like to draw your attention, consists in its fictional dimension, part of that mythologizing of him which began yet during his life. In this regard, I recall only 3 following novels coming from 3 different countries. First, Claudio Gatti, Il Presagio, thriller esoterico, Rizzoli Publishing House, 1996, only 1 edition, translated into Romanian by Geo Vasile, Polyrom Publishing House. Umberto Eco wrote some acid, very critical phrases on this novel in his famous 1996 article, in which he praised Ted Anton's book, released that year in America. Unfortunately and mysteriously, this is for me, it's still not clear, Umberto Eco's excellent reception of Anton's book, this review was published on La Repubblica and also in America, did not lead to its translation and publication in a suitable Italian publishing house. The second novel, Laurenzio Orosciano, Migrații, Icon Publishing House, Bucharest, 2015. A chapter of this novel, which takes place in 3 different historical periods, is dedicated to Culianu. And the third novel is the last one, the most recent, Pablo Mauret, La Migración, Argentine edition 2020, Italian translation, Time is a River, Il Tempo è un Fiume, it's the book. Salani, Editore, 2022. This interesting novel, set between Chicago, Buenos Aires, and Romania, especially Moldavia and Iași, in 3 moments spaced 25 years apart, 1991, 2016, 2041, with this distance of 25 years, which with fascinating insight on the theme of metempsychosis, bears a title very similar to that of Orosciano, La Migración and Migrații, migrations, where the meaning in the novel of Orosciano of migration does not concern the migration of souls, but the migration as a historical exile or expatriation from Romania in the 20th century. I am glad to have proposed this novel to Teresa and Sorin Antohi, and it seems that it will be now translated into Romanian. These 3 topics, which I have only briefly discussed here, will be further explored later in the course of the research, where I will also welcome your suggestions and information, especially on the so-called critical literature or secondary literature on Culianu in the various countries and languages of which you are aware of. Thank you for your attention.
Horia, don't go. I want to ask you a few questions, if you please. Yes, indeed, the novel by Pablo Mauret is going to be published. We visited together the publishing house, and things are on their way. The contract was signed. Things are going in the right direction. And thanks for initiating this project, because it was through you that we discovered that there was such a thing as a novel. Now, do you see have you identified any kind of support from the Romanian Cultural Institute from any of these books published in Italy?
Yes, for Eucharisterio, we received that, but only after, yes, well, it was rejected first, because, you know, it depends on various persons who are working there, and they have to manage the budget and everything. So first it was rejected, and I remember that Teresa was not so happy. She said, "Oh, you see, you know, everything is in the same way here in Romania." But I said to her, "But don't worry, we have to wait next year, no?" So next year we were a winner with Eucharisterio, so there is a support, but the support is subordinated to the projects. So it depends on the publishing houses and on the score on of these projects. For now, I remember only this example. Yes, in Italy, but it is possible maybe also in other countries. I don't know. I don't think, for instance, that the Japanese correspondence between Eliade and Culianu, I don't think was supported by TPS program. But I would like, for instance, maybe with Igor, Tavilla, to work on this correspondence in Italian translation. I think there is a public and there is a market for these two scholars, and for their correspondence.
The other question is, because we discussed a little bit about this over email and so forth, but what is it with these publishers in Italy, for instance, that do not obey to the normal rules, commercial rules of copyright and so forth, rather visible, because we know that one of the practices that has been, how I say, institutionalized at the Romanian Cultural Institute is to give a lot of money to totally obscure publishers, let alone translators. And thus, this is a way of killing a title by simply relegating it to a minor publishing house that never produces, most of the time, never produces enough copies or at all. And thus, the book exists in bibliographies, but never exists. So it has a immaterial, let's say it's part of the immaterial patrimony of the Romanian culture, but somehow it never gets to become material. So what is it that is blocking the application of international rules on copyright in the case of Culianu? Because I know you told me about such things.
Well, I don't know. Culianu is a special case, but for instance, if we talk about Mircea Cărtărescu, who's the best known living writer, or one of the best known living Romanian writers, he was translated by Professor Bruno Mazzoni and published by Volant, which is a not so small publishing house. Volant of Rome, very strong in fiction. So first we saw Cărtărescu there in Volant. Of course, with the support of Romanian Cultural Institute. But last year, I saw the first book of Cărtărescu published by Il Saggiatore, which is, more important publishing house. So it's also the market. It depends. Sometimes it depends also on the market. Now, if as we saw with Culianu, before this book, nobody wanted to publish him. No. After that, we saw 1 year after. Of course, this is a reprint. No, but something moved. After that, we have the Antares issue. After our Antares issue, we saw this was a very big surprise, the third edition, because I see that we have these editions now, which are quite recent, but of the same book. So something is moving, but of course we have to support this movement. And yes, we have to talk about different, works. I don't know. For instance, La Terza is not interested in republished Esperienze dell'Esteri. But La Terza is very big. Some of these big publishing houses are now in a difficult context.
Yes.
Also, Yakabuk. So sometimes the small or medium publishing houses are better than a big one.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you very much. I think this completes the portrait of the situation in the image of the situation in Italy. And Italy is, as Horia indicated, actually the only country outside Romania where there is something, a visible interest, measurable interest in Culianu's work. Now,
for instance, excuse me, Sorin,
yes.
one more example. Let's talk about this novel, Emerald Gate.
Yes.
I cannot translate it into Italian, from Romanian, because the original is in English.
No.
So the best situation would be to publish it first in English,
Yes.
United States or I don't know where. After that, will be more simple.
I agree. I agree. We now, as you know,
there are many languages there.
no, we now have the hope, as I indicated last night, that maybe after the making and then the successful circulation of the documentary that is under preparation on Culianu in the United States, something is going to change there. Because, yes, many European publishers actually watch the developments on the US, that is global, US and global book markets, to get inspiration from there. And obviously, books in smaller countries, in smaller languages, and so forth, get a lot of inspiration from the canonical list of translations and authors that is developed by the Anglo-Saxon, which means English and US international publishers. So hopefully something along those lines is going to develop. In the meantime, of course, writing on Culianu is also one of the tasks that should mobilize us, and somehow an attempt to place discussions about Culianu in the network of scholarly publications worldwide, in scholarly journals and so forth, using a pretext or another, an anniversary, commemoration, connection to bigger topics, that is continuously somehow keeping up a certain interest in some Romanian scholars from various disciplines, especially from philosophy, history of religions, literary studies, are, although modestly, entering the international, academic market or academic milieu with smaller scale discussions of Culianu, such as, for instance, presentations at congresses, conferences, symposia. Such things occur in Italy, especially once again, but also in Britain, around the University of Cambridge, or even the University of Oxford. So things are somehow moving, but not at the speed and on a scale that we would be happy with. So I guess we are going to stop now this session and have a break. We'll return at 5 p.m. Romanian time. So see you later. Thank you.